Today's Friday. If she's going down, she would do it. Friday.
Morning.
17th, right. Friday the 17th of October. We are nearly through the first week. You realize that? How it has gone? Are you still with us? No jet lag? Mental legs? Right. Just a few announcements. I won't take up too much of Joy's valuable time. The diagram is available for you. It's on the back table there, 10 each, please. So just take and leave money. The group photos, I put a list down here for you to put your name on. If you want the group photo from Gunnar.
I said to Adam this morning, what can we try to crack today? And it's rather nice. I get the first crack at it, and then Jeffrey can pursue it, Adam can lay it all out. Get it all straight and organized. And I think it's working very well, if you ask me. I'd much rather be first and make all the beginning mistakes, and then you end up, at least before you go to bed, with it nicely tucked away in order in your mind, and ready for the next day to get whirling action again. Full hotties again at work, hurdling the masses, hurdling space, and so on, and the process can start all over again. A new Manvantara has begun. So today we come to stanza 6. You will note that I'm really, therefore, for those of you who are staying, and I suppose for those of you who are leaving, you'll be interested to know, I really am spending much more time on stanza 7, quite obviously, since all of next week will be devoted to that. There are good and sufficient reasons for that, as I think all of you familiar with the Secret Doctrine can probably realize for yourselves. I don't have to spell it all out. But these first 6, and particularly 3, 4, 5, and 6, set the stage. Now, with the 6th, as you all know, we come to some very remarkable but some very remarkable changes that are occurring. First of all, HPB tells us that this stanza is translated from the Chinese text. Precisely what that means, of course, we have no idea, and we can only conjecture. First of all, she says that the real esoteric nomenclature cannot be given, which, of course, we recognize because this is an attempt for the very first time to put something into English that has obviously never been in translation before, at least in a vernacular such as English. And then she points out that the Brahmanical doctrine, which to a large extent she has been following, not completely, but to a large extent, has no equivalent for the terms that she now wishes to present to us in further stages of the cosmogonic process. Now, as has been pointed out by many scholars, even though she's resorted to Chinese Buddhist terms, she uses these in a very unusual sense. I'm sure Muriel would agree with that. And so while she says she's translated it from the Chinese, heaven only knows what Chinese text she was using and what her translation was. It was obviously her own, or at least her teachers, because the terms are certainly not looked at from an orthodox point of view by any means. So don't just run off with these terms to a Chinese Buddhist scholar and think you know what that scholar is going to say, because he's going to say that you're really off the beaten track somewhere. Something is amiss. So obviously she has done it simply for what she feels is convenience. It may be a little bit inconvenient for us, but nevertheless, there it is. Now, as we also recognize, a tremendous and highly significant change of focus occurs midway in this stanza. Although we certainly must assume that the pattern that is outlined must hold true. That we have emphasized, I think, again and again. Certainly Adam in his book emphasizes it very, very much, that the pattern holds true. In the main, holds true. Whether we're talking about our system, our planetary system, our globe, our individual evolution, that is through what has been called these major developmental stages, root races, I think perhaps the most unfortunate of words that could ever have been selected in some ways, and undoubtedly far, far from the mark of what was originally indicated. This has led to more controversy, I suppose, well, other than some of the other fascinating controversies like Mars, Mercury, God only knows what all, but anyway, this term has led to more bitterness and some really misunderstandings. So, anyway, there it is. It's very clear that the master in one of the letters to Sinnott says, you decide on the terms. Our terms are nearly untranslatable. And so you decide on the terms that we will use, and we'll try to fit our concepts into your terms. It must have been a staggering undertaking, and one can only admire the two Mahatmas for an extraordinary patience in attempting to fit into the terms that Sinnott offered, concepts that were indeed untranslatable. One comes up against this in trying to communicate, with someone whose language is totally dissimilar, and saying, well, all right, I'll accept that term and I'll try to sort of fit into it. So here in the middle, following shloka 4, as you know, of this stanza, comes this tremendous shift. And she herself says that with these ends that portion of the stanzas. This is page 151 in the first volume of the poem. In the original edition. I don't know where it is in the Adyar edition, but somewhere it's following shloka 4 of stanza 6. With these verses ends that portion which relates to the universal cosmogony. And now, from this verse onwards, the stanzas are concerned only with our solar system in general, with the planetary change therein inferentially, and with the history of our globe especially. So, does this indicate that the process for our globe and our history and our solar system and inferentially the planetary chain of which this globe is the densest, does this mean that in some way there is a variation of the pattern of universal cosmogony? It might be a legitimate inference to make, just as we may assume that, just as we know that every crystal, while following a pattern, a known matrix of development, is different, has variations, so we must assume that while the central axis of development, if I can call it that, or matrix of development, is the same, is identical, the concretion of the elements, of the factors involved, must have some variation. From this point of view, we can perhaps say that the experiment going forward in our particular chain and on our particular globe has never been tried before. And I think that's a legitimate claim. It has never been tried before. I think we would all concur in that. Hence the possibility of failure. When you've never tried anything before, you're not quite certain how it's going to come out. It's like, you know, making a cake from a new recipe or variation. All cakes have similar ingredients, but they don't all taste the same, quite obviously. Proportions differ, and some ingredients are added and some subtracted and so on. So one can perhaps take this as a general statement. But if we can extract then, as I feel one can do, from the pattern, then what we face in indeed stanza 7 does stand as a pattern, although it may be a variation of the fundamental pattern. It is at this point, of course, that HPB pauses in the whole process, in the developmental process of cosmogenesis, to introduce some very, I think, some of the most pertinent remarks. And there are about 40 pages of this, indeed. I think it is just about 40 pages. It's more than that. Lose track of this. It's from 152 to 191. There are virtually 40 pages given over to what constitute, I suggest, three of the most fundamental and most helpful concepts presented. And she speaks of them as misconceptions that obviously had already arisen in her time. And I think that's rather interesting that, you know, if we think that a lot of misunderstandings have arisen in 100 years, imagine that even within the brief time since the presentation of any of these ideas in the West, through, say, Isis Unveiled, and then the work of Sinnott, which introduced some variations and therefore led to some misconceptions that even in this brief time she was having to correct a number of misconceptions concerning three very important concepts. One, the planets and rounds, concerned with the planets. The second, and that included, of course, the septenary, the constitution of the macrocosm and the septenary constitution of man, and she was presenting it. The whole concept of what I call monadology, that's a perfectly good word, incidentally.
Surprised you didn't make it monadicity.
Yes, I know. Well, see, I just want to keep you alert, here is where she gives us the tremendous understanding of the division of the monadic host, a subject with which I know Adam has dealt in other places, as I've heard him speak on it. Is it in this book, or it's in this book also, isn't it? But I think you had it also in your Blavatsky lecture, was it?
Yes.
Yes. Also. So that is an extremely important, and what is meant by a monad, she uses it in a different term, a different, slightly different meaning than Leibniz. She's very clear on this. Again, one has to use her definitions. I mean, she's very much like Alice. When I use a word, it means what I want it to mean, and not necessarily what anybody else has said it means. And that's, you know, you have to follow through on that. Jeffrey, I think, has been referring to some of this. We have to use it in her definition, and not think that we can play around and say, well, that word has appeared in Leibniz, and therefore I'm going to read Leibniz. It's perfectly all right to read Leibniz, and one gets a certain feeling for the word out of that, and so on. And then, of course, what I think is one of the really exciting presentations that is given to us, and one that has yet to be somehow taken up by contemporary science, and that is the concept of a triple evolutionary scheme, triple scheme for the development of man. A marvelous section that I think one could indeed, I suppose, take a full program of the European school on just these three, just that 40 pages. I think it would well repay. And I certainly think that within those 40 pages contains some of the most pregnant and important and significant, profound teachings that are given to us, in my view. They deserve far more exploration than has ever been given to them. So take that in.
Joy, what were your titles then? You said three. You had Planets and Rounds.
Planets, Rounds, the Monadology, and Monadology is the triple evolutionary scheme. I divide it in that way. Now, there may be other ways, but they're interlinked, of course, but I divide it as those three fundamental areas of concern which she is setting straight here. Now, she indicates at the outset of that some 11 stanzas have been omitted. This, of course, leads us to question the numbering, obviously, of the stanzas, because when she picks up the thread again at the fourth round, and as she says, between shloka 4 and shloka 5, extend long ages, and there now gleams the dawn and sunrise of another eon. A long time has elapsed. Why then does she number this next one 5? Why does she pick up, you say, if she has omitted all of these? Is it because underlying there is this pattern, and that we are to, Dora Kuntz always says, crack our brains to discover what is the underlying pattern, even though we have moved swiftly to a variation of that pattern, which is our fourth round and now our globe.
Is it that you think, Joy, the first 4 stanzas are to deal with an outline of the process, the way the cosmos works in its sevenfold nature and that kind of thing, the cyclicity of everything? We're given the broad principles and also the primeval origins.
I think that's true.
When we get to our particular thing, we're based on the same framework of the process, the same pattern of events, so to speak, occurring, the same evolutionary program, but applied to different things, a different admixture of the forms and with their characteristics and functions that apply only to this solar system and the planets. It's that detail.
It's that detail that changes.
Becomes specific.
It now becomes specific. Yes, it now becomes specific, and that's why I'm suggesting, in its specific nature, it constitutes a variation on the general theme.
So what she would have omitted would probably be in the specific nature of the earlier
It may
form,
well be,
so that we
because
pick up
she
at the
is-
same
yes.
point of time as before us.
You see, she says, among the 11 stanzas omitted, there is one which gives a full description of the formation of the planetary chains one after another, and might indeed have given us the specific information as to whether we're the fourth or fifth.
Yeah.
You know, you see. And she, from her point of view, that probably was irrelevant. And I think it is irrelevant, you see. Although we get people arguing over this. Believe me, we do. You see. And it becomes excessively important. Well, I'm not sure it is that important at all. I've never felt that one has to get terribly heated up about it. I think there are far more important matters to be considered. But in this sequence, then, it almost seems as though Shloka 5 is out of place. I don't know how the rest of you feel, those of you. But it almost seems as though the better sequence would be from Shloka 4 to Shloka 6. And it's interesting to note this. Now, I may be quite in error. I'm always in error. I'm quite willing to be in error. But 4 is the action of Thoha in building the worlds in the likeness of older wheels. We'll look at this, and placing them on the imperishable centers, the Laya centers, about which I really want to speak this morning. And then, you see, if you turn to Shloka 6, the older wheels rotated downwards and upwards and so on, all of that. And Shloka 5 somehow seems, and as she herself says, the full meaning is really only in connection with her whole explication of anthropogenesis. It's an interesting, why did she throw this in? I don't know. But it seems in some ways to be out of place here. Almost taken as though she's going to really get us into the fourth round, but then in a sense returns to, and indeed she says this on page 199, the reader must return once more to cosmogony, which would indicate a process that has the pattern, that contains the pattern. So it's something to consider. I don't know that has ever been really considered, so I bring it up for your consideration, because she indicates that, and indicates in a sense, therefore, that Shloka 5 is part of this side issue which she has brought in, you see. So it's something that, as I say, I haven't seen referred to anywhere this particular suggestion that is sort of thrown in and may not really have bearing. And consequently, the calculations that are called for in Shloka 7 cannot really be made at this stage. Again, that Shloka 7 is a kind of foreshadowing of what's going to develop out of all of anthropogenesis. Make thy calculations, if thou wouldst learn the correct age of thy small wheel. Well, endless numbers of people have attempted calculations, mathematical equations, etc. etc. So again, it seems to me that 5 and 7 are really part of the whole anthropogenesis development, whereas 6 continues the cosmogonic process. Merely call your attention to that. Yeah?
Yes, on this question of the numbering, if we see her note at the end of the poem, when she again says that only portions have been translated,
Yes. Oh, yes.
has the numbering that she uses any connection with the original layout?
I would judge not. I
No.
would judge not.
No.
But I feel that I somehow feel she must have had a reason.
Well, that's where I think my little plan,
Yeah.
that the master suggested
Yes.
this kind of reflective
Oh, yes.
process.
Yeah.
I don't know. But
I do. I think it does, Bianchi, and that's why I'm convinced there's a reason, for example, why she has these stanzas numbered as she has, 7, and the shlokas within them numbered 1, 2, 3. Whereas in anthropogenesis, one feels, at least I feel very strongly that in anthropogenesis she just sort of suddenly throws in stanza 1, stanza 2, without relation to a proper breaking point, and therefore it's better to, my feeling when I deal with with volume 2, with anthropogenesis, which I'm not dealing with, of course, at all here, because I wanted to focus on cosmogonic processes, the pattern. But the way in which I deal with anthropogenesis is to disregard stanza and look at shlokas 1 through 49. Forget the stanza number because it has it's as though she's gotten a certain number of shlokas and feels like throwing in stanza 3, just at the heading, as it were, without relation to a proper break in sequence. Whereas here, there generally has been some specific breaking until we come to this one. That is not true, I think, in stanza 7, which I'll deal with next week. Now this is my feeling. As I say, I could be far wide of the mark, but there we are. When I've left after next week, the Holy Trinity here can set everything straight again.
We'll let you know if we do.
All right. Well, now we come then to the beginning, at least, of stanza 6. And there are a couple of things that I want to pick up that have yet to be added into this. The previous stanzas have told us the story of what we can call descending or emanating hierarchies. I was very much struck with the diagram which Adam gave us yesterday because it opened new insights for me, and I had never quite seen it in that way before. And I think this is the value of diagrams. Not to get stuck in them. I don't think we should ever get stuck in diagrams. They are two-dimensional representations in the first place. You can carry them only so far, and if you try to push them beyond their natural limits, their natural explanations, one gets into a lot of trouble, a tremendous amount of trouble, so one should never press that too far, but take it as far as it has some significance and some meaning. And I think that in that we began to see how the hierarchies do unfold in terms of their emanational aspects in the whole creative process. Now, for the first time in stanza 6, we're introduced to a concept of what might be called residual impressions in the matrix, which is our present manifested system. Impressions derive from previous manifestations, impressions which remain. The word that is often technically used is sishta, and meaning seed, that it's a remainder. This, of course, carries us back, if you like, to the second fundamental proposition, which premises the eternity of the universe in toto as a boundless plane, periodically the playground of numberless universes incessantly manifesting and disappearing. But the disappearing is not final and complete, nor is the manifesting something totally new. We may ask then, what is new? Prem and Ashish, in their development of this in Man the Measure, suggest that the substance of forms is always old. They are always built up from the remains of previous forms and are variations or repetitions of things that have been before. Newness lies in the experience of the living beings, utilizing those forms. There's an advance in consciousness then, but which affects form, because all form is conscious too. But the consciousness utilizing the form advances. But there are those residual impressions which have to be part of it. And I think here we follow very much the pattern that Adam has suggested earlier, that there is always this recapitulation until one comes to the seventh of any cycle, is virtually total recapitulation. Now it isn't then left for the beginning of one. It's not a kind of leap across an abyss, if I can put it this way, in which one takes, you leave all your baggage behind. And there it is, and you've packed your bags for the last time, but you've left them all behind. Something is taken. Something is taken. So, in this, we need to understand what may be the residual impressions that are there. I'm going to largely skip over, therefore, Shloka 1, although I'd just like to comment that here we are, of course, very much more concerned with this agency of the process of exteriorization, the work carried out by our good friend Foha. It may be helpful in this to revert to some of the terminology that we've used previously, and to which HPB refers in her commentary, of course, in defining the phrase, the mother of mercy and knowledge, Kuan Yin. For this we can again turn to, of course, the great Vedantist Theosophical Society, as he expounds the emergence of the universe in his work, The Philosophy of the Bhagavad Gita. As he points out, Para Brahman, which exists before all things in the cosmos, is the one essence from which starts into existence a center of energy, which I shall for the present call the Logos, he says. This Logos may be called, he gives three names, Ishvara, Atman, or the primeval, the original Atman, or Shabda Brahman, that is the sound, the sound Brahman, the creative potential of sound. It is called the Verbum. It is called Avalokiteshvara by the Buddhists. At any rate, he says, Avalokiteshvara in one sense is the Logos in general, though no doubt in the Chinese doctrine there are also other ideas. That is true, connected with Avalokiteshvara. So what Subarao points out is that in every doctrine there is posited a center of spiritual energy which exists in a latent condition in the absolute and starts as a center of conscious energy at the time of cosmic activity. Such centers of energy, says Cicero, are almost innumerable in the bosom of Paravana. But we must not be confused by this collectivity, I think. He is very clear on this point that the light from the Logos, which is called in the Bhagavad Gita Daiva Prakriti, we've already come across that, this is all at one and the same time the mother and also the daughter of the Logos, or Verba. The mother, or as HPB says, or abstract ideal matter, Mula Prakriti, the root of nature. And that light of the Logos is also known, as we know, as Fohat. So we have basically in the first shloka, again, reference to a calling forth from an undifferentiated condition of a differentiation which we know as the universe. And this is very clear in what Cicero speaks of as jnata, jnanam, and jnayam, ego, non-ego, and consciousness in the philosophy of the Bhagavad Gita. There isn't time to explore that in detail. But I recommend that along with this you really read the philosophy of the Bhagavad Gita, particularly the first lecture. The first lecture contains all of this. So the mention in this first shloka of the triple of Quan Sha Yin implies that we're not dealing with the accepted division of universal mind into father-mother, the usual division, a duality represented in classical Hinduism as Mahabuddhi, or in Buddhism as Prajna Upaya, but with a triplicity. And I think that's why HPB has perhaps introduced that here, because the classical systems generally deal with a duality at this level, a polarization. But here immediately we have the triple, so that there is a triplicity that must be accounted for. And that triplicity is indeed expounded by Cicero in terms of the Vedanta philosophy. So it is present, but we don't often think of it. We have been dealing up to this point with a kind of polarization. Now she points to this triplicity. But Shloka 2 continues the description of the process then, by which Fohat, now called the swift and radiant one, he is, as the light of the Logos, he is the radiant one, swift, organizes the potential objectivity of space in conformity with inner or archetypal patterns, and the centers through which the inner patterns are projected, and around which outer objectivity is organized, and through which that objectivity is again withdrawn into their transcendent source, are now called the 7 Laya centers. I'll put that up there. We've already met with this concept, of course, in stanza 5, especially shloka 3, where Fohat separates the sparks, forms therewith the germs of wheels, places them in the 6 directions of space, and one in the middle, the central wheel. Now this action in producing, and that is the term that is used here, and I want to comment in a moment on HPB's use of the word produce, which is, I think, a rather interesting one. It's not, you see, she's talked about radiation, she's talked about emanation. Now there is a production. That's, I think, interesting. We'll come back to that. But this action of Fohat is a gyratory motion. We've seen that in the diagram that Günther uses. It's a gyratory motion. Gyratory is a circular. Now we can indicate that in one sense there are 3 types of motion. I don't know how really to describe them, but there are 3 types of motion. The radiation from a center, which is, we may see a downward motion, and around that a gyration, a forming of a field, as it were, which is a gyratory, perhaps more in that sort of way. So that there is a downward, there is a movement also outward, which I can't do in this, as well as the gyratory motion. So we have to, of course, you want to look up gyratory?
There is gyro, because we get gyroscope from
Yes,
it.
we get gyroscope from
I
it.
look at other things, I don't know what it means.
I'm not sure either, the root of it.
Something spinning.
I think it's spinning, isn't it?
Spins on its own axis
Spins
and
on its
along.
own axis
And along a path.
and along a path,
Yes.
doesn't it? Yes, that's what I was thinking, but I don't know the actual derivation, gyro in the Greek. It is a Greek word, of course, it comes from the Greek, and often is called circumgyratory, which means then around, around its own axial lines, you see. So one way of describing these three types of motion is outflow, inflow, and gyration.
It comes from the Greek word gyros, a ring.
Ring. But it is generally a spinning around an axis.
Gyrate is to go in a circle or spiral, revolve, whirl, hence gyration.
Hence gyration.
But it is not always upward.
No, not necessarily. No, not necessarily. So their combination, of course, this movement makes the content of universal mind perceptible as manifest phenomena. We have such phrases, you see, in stanza 5 as Fohat traces spiral lines, Fohat runs circular errands, and so on. So these are very, very descriptive. Now, it is these modes of action that produce what are known as Laya centers, you see. This is a very interesting concept that is given to us, because HPB informs us that these are the eternal foundations on which a universe is seated. And she comments further, it is from these centers that begins the differentiation of the elements which enter into the constitution of our solar system. So that's why we need to examine this point a little bit. Now, first of all, HPB calls these Laya centers the 7 0 points. Using the term zero, she says, in the same sense that chemists do, to indicate a point at which, in esotericism, the scale of reckoning of differentiation begins. And we need, I think, to understand just what she means by that statement. Premanashe suggests that these centers may be equated to the sparks or jivas, the individualized points of the cosmic conspiring, the cosmic knowing. So the 7 Laya centers are the modes of the modes by which space is filled, space is always full, by which space becomes handleable, that we can deal with it in some manner. They may be compared to the points in our own psyche, around which are organized the structures of our psychic life on any level, whether sensation, feeling, or thought. Actually, in terms of our own personal internal structure, these Laya centers become the undifferentiated points which make experience possible. This is an analogy almost. But they are the centers in our psyche which are brought into activity when events occur that we translate into experience. Experiences come and go, but the center which makes any experience possible remains constant. We can also define a Laya center as a point of disappearance, in the sense that it is that point, a mystical point really, where one thing disappears from one plane into another, one mode of existence. It reappears on another plane or in another mode of existence. So let me illustrate further, because Jeffrey was looking a little confused on
Well,
that.
I'm bothered a bit about this centers in receipt of experience. Psychic
yes.
things. I'm not quite with
Well,
that.
all right, let me suggest simply an analogy. Simply, and again, like diagrams, don't push analogies too far. But sometimes they are helpful, I think. An event occurs. It has a great number of factors in the event. A great number of factors are present in any event which occurs.
They're like a motor car accident.
Yes, that's right. There are many, many things. And when it first happens, there is a vast number of details that you have to take account of, you see. Well, even in looking at a tree, all right, looking at a tree, this may be a good example. That's an event. When you see it, it is an event. I'm not saying that it's not there unless you look at it. That, please, I'm not saying anything of that sort. But it is an event. Well, if you see the tree for the first time, and you really look at the tree, you see bark, you see leaves, you see limbs. There's a great number of factors there. Now, from that is derived through this point, or which is non-existent, a 0 point, which is, a point has no dimensions. You pull into memory one thing, tree. When that memory is touched and reawakened in somehow, it moves out again, sort of on the other side, if I can put it that way, so that you don't even have to look at the tree, as an object with bark, with limbs, with leaves, with changing leaves, dropping leaves, with different kinds of bark, with squirrels running up and down, and so on. But it passes through this non-existent point to become experience. Does that make sense? Now, where, you see, as you said yesterday, where is all this memory stored? Where is this non-existent point? It's non-existent. Yet there is that point that translates the multiplicity of the event into experience, which can be then reassembled in all of its multiplicity, sometimes fancifully, sometimes truthfully. That is, we may endow the tree with much more than it actually has, you see, when it comes back through. But all the time, events are passing through this interior psychic point. And that's the nearest that I can come to a description of this. It's the nearest analogy that I can think of. But I think it helps.
In fact, this is where the universe exists for us.
For us.
We're not there, that universe
That's right.
isn't there.
That's
For us.
For us, you see. So, that's why it is said that it's also a point of disappearance, because, of course, it comes from the verbal root li, Sanskrit, which means to dissolve. Now, everything out of all the event has dissolved into what I call an experience, you see. This is why I define experience in a different way than most people define it. You see, most people would say experiences are things that happen to you. All right? I don't think so at all. Is that shocking? An experience is when you happen to things. It's when you happen to events. So I turn it around.
So what's the literal meaning of li?
To dissolve or disintegrate. So it's a state or a condition in which substance becomes homogeneous, and is unable to act or differentiate. It is the power of thought that calls it into activity as well as produces the Laya center itself. So a Laya center, D. Perucker, for example, suggests that a Laya center may be conceived of as a canal, a channel, through which the vitality of the superior spheres pours down into and inspires, inbreathes into the lower planes or states of matter, or rather of substance. So the Laya center in that sense is the critical line dividing one field from another. It's that critical state which is reached. When you boil water, there is a critical state before it becomes steam, in which it is neither bubbling water nor steam. There's a critical point. In chemistry, I think it's called critical point.
The only chemistry that I remember is dipping litmus paper into acids.
Yes. Yes.
And if you start with it pink,
It turns
and then
blue.
it eventually turns blue. Now, is there a critical point? I can't remember.
Yes,
when
there
it
is.
is neither pink nor
Yes.
blue.
You see, this
Or
is
it is both pink and blue.
this is the point. There is a critical point, you see. There has to be a critical point. I remember that also out of my chemistry. I guess we did that all over the Western world. We used litmus paper. I also remember putting sulfuric acid into a beaker and my professor saying it's perfectly all right to do that. And of course, in the process of pouring it into whatever was already in the beaker, which I don't remember at this moment, I lost the sleeve of a whole jacket. It was not all right, and it blew up. And fortunately, it didn't injure my arm, but took the sleeve of my jacket, and that was the end. And I thought, you know, like the little moron who was given a sleeveless sweater for Christmas said, I must now cut off my arms if I am to wear this.
Joy, would you repeat your definition of experience that you gave us a minute ago, please?
It's when you happen to an event. In other words, you as the psychic structure happen to the event. And
Sorry, may I correct you? I think you said happen to things.
Right.
An event
Yes.
is when you happen to things.
things, yes. When you happen to things or events, yes.
That is the event.
Yes, that becomes an event. In other words, one can walk through the world. I am sure one can walk through the world and see nothing of it. Just as, you know, the typical American, yes, I quite grant you, walks through much of the world seeing only Hilton hotels. And never sees them, you see. This is why I say the process of growth, for example, and one sees this reflected, I think, through the stages, both at the cosmogonic and the anthropogonic level. The process of growth is not that there's some extra cosmic deity throwing more furniture into the world, but that we become aware of the furniture that is in the world.
I have a homely example of this. When I retired, I went to live in the country. And the longer I lived there, the more I learned to observe nature. The birds in the hedgerow, the state of buds, flowers, leaves, their colours and things, all registered. you
Yeah.
see. Well, on one or two occasions, after I'd been there some time, I went for a walk with a countryman who'd been born in the country.
Ah.
And his perception of what went on in the country was far greater than mine.
Yes.
And I used to marvel, how do you know what's going on? They'd know where the fox earths were, they'd know where the badgers lived, they'd know everything. Almost without effort.
Yes.
Well, the interesting thing is, when I'd been there a little while, people would come out from the towns, you see, and I would marvel at their blindness.
Yes, that's right.
They never saw anything
Never
of
saw anything of what was going on.
They
That's
hadn't
right.
been educated.
Yes. But take that countryman and put him in the center of London, you say.
Oh, he'd be horrified.
He'd be bewildered because he's not able to sort it out.
He would.
And we are very able, if we've been brought up in cities, we sort out all of these things and know how to cross the street, and we know what, we get a sixth sense as to whether a car is coming up behind us and so on, don't we?
Well, the women used to say that. They didn't even like to go into town shopping, even though it was cheaper than going to a local shop. They said they were bewildered,
Yes.
even though this was a small country town.
That's right. So I think you see, this is why we can say that this is a point where one stage dissolves, has not yet become another. It's the critical point, therefore. It's the opening, and that's why I think D. Peruker conceives it as a channel through which the substance, as he suggests, or the vitality, the energy of one state, one condition, is transferred to another condition. Judith Tyberg, she's died now, a tremendous student of Sanskrit and of Theosophy. I first met her at Covina soon after D. Peruker's death, and at that time she was working on a giant dictionary of Sanskrit, Latin, Greek, and Hebrew terms, which I think, so far as I know, has never been published, but it was and I tried to find out what happened to her manuscript. But in her work, Sanskrit Keys to the Wisdom Religion, she comments, the Laya centers spoken of in Theosophy refer to those disappearing points, or foci, or channels, through which consciousness, or life atoms, pass when going from one plane to another, from higher to lower, or from lower to higher. They are like doors which lead in two directions, downwards and upwards, or rather outwards and inwards. Modern science deals only with matter up to this zero or disappearing point. But Theosophy and occultism deal with worlds beyond that. The heart or center of any being is a Laya center, through which lives of many grades constantly flow back and forth.
In Sanskrit, it's the mudra. In Sanskrit, it's the mudra.
Yes, yes. Now, I think it's interesting to compare this term with the northern Buddhistic term alaya, that which is non-dissolvable. You see. And you see that there is that also that which underlies all of the dissolvability of existence, which is alaya, the non-dissolvable. It is that, of course, that is referred to by H.P.B. in The Voice of the Silence. Man is called the channel of that, non-dissolvable. I think one of the great verses of The Voice of the Silence, alas, alas, that all men should possess alaya, and that possessing it, it should so little avail them. Because our focus is on the laya, the dissolvability of event into experience, or experience into recognition of things, you see. And this is incidentally this double door, because it's through that laya center in the psyche, if you like, that recognition occurs, recognition, recollection, and so on. But that underlying all of that is indeed the non-dissolvable. Well, so important is this concept that I think we have to really try to understand it as thoroughly as we can. It's not a concept which we find given very much attention in our later literature at all, as you say.
Please Would that mean that each of us have a Laya center or 7 Laya centers?
7 Laya centers.
Within each of us?
In our
Yes.
total
Yes,
constitution.
in our total constitution.
That's interesting. Thank
Yes.
you.
But it's possible, the dissolvability is possible only because, if one can put it this way, of the fabric of non-dissolvability.
That makes our continuity.
That makes our continuity. And now, Barborka, for example, gives a great deal of attention to this in the divine plan, and suggests that when a system enters pralaya, the state of absolute rest, all matter becomes homogeneous, and the higher principles of a system are transferred from the deceased body to a laya center, there to remain as skandhas, to use the technical term. The skandhas of a sun will bring forth a sun, just as the skandhas of a planet will produce a planet. When awakened into...
Sorry, could you read that again? I missed that.
This is
Sounds
Barborka.
important.
Yes, this is Barborka. When a system enters this state of pralaya, that absolute...
You say paralaya?
Yeah.
Is that a contraction of paralaya?
No,
I
pralaya.
know, but is
Yeah.
it, has it come...
No, I think not. Pra stands in its own right. Then all matter is homogenized.
Yes, we get that.
And the higher principles are transferred of any system, whether the system be a sun or planet or man. The principles are transferred from the deceased body to a laya center, there to remain as skandhas, as you say, as bundles of attributes. The skandhas of a sun will bring forth a sun, just as the skandhas of a planet will produce a planet. For the skandhas are not of a single plane, but pertain to the 7 planes of being. When awakened into life by Fohat, and I'm still quoting Barborka, when awakened into life by Fohat, the higher principles that had belonged to a former sun become linked with a world germ and commence the process of aggregation and formation of a new center, as well as setting in motion the potencies which will eventually manifest as a new sun. So, he uses skandhas here. These are also, you can also say the sistras, the seeds, you see. So every system is the reemergence and recapitulation, then, in a sense, of previous systems, variations on a theme, if you like. And so, of course, Barborka, using the law of analogy, points out the same process occurs when a human being dies. Yes, sir.
Can you state what page that's
In the Divine Plan, page 239. Now, the actual process by which, then, these worlds or wheels come into being, awakened through the laya centers, is, of course, in Shloka 6 of this stanza 6. But one thing that I want to comment on is the verb produce. He produces, Fohat, the swift and radiant one, produces the 7 laya centers. And one might wonder whether that is a correct verb at this point. The word here is, of course, derived from dukere, to draw out, and forward. So it's not that Fohat creates something, the laya centers, out of nothing. Of course, nothing is created out of nothing. But awakens them into activity and draws them forward into a motion that is described elsewhere in the stanzas as rotatory. So I think we have to think of that term produce as drawing them now into a motion, drawing them forward into a motion. And here we may be reminded of a statement which HPB quotes later. This is page 258 of Volume 1, 258 and 259, in which she quotes from a text which she identifies as the Book of Dzyan, Commentary 3, Para 18. So it's interesting. What do you say further in this?
That's a pretty specific reference to a specific book.
It is.
And yet they haven't found it.
And yet you see they haven't found it. But she quotes from that text, "Whatsoever quits the Laya state becomes active life. It is drawn into the vortex of motion, the alchemical solvent of life. Spirit and matter are the two states of the one, which is neither spirit nor matter, both being the absolute life latent." And she continues then her own commentary on this commentary by pointing out that absolute life cannot produce an inorganic atom, whether single or complex, and there is life even in Laya, just as a man in a profound cataleptic state, to all appearance a corpse, is still a living being.
This would account for the centres which Fohat produces properly being awakened, because they mustn't be the result of what was before. They must be pre-existing.
That's right, you see. So I think this points to this very important point that it must have been pre-existent. And just as we recognize objects because the perception has been, it's not that something is suddenly put there, you see, but because there has been that passing through the Laya center on its way outward again, has produced a recognition, a remembrance, or recollection. We put it together again, and all of the separate elements, we then put it together and we say that's a chair. And so it's a kind of analogous.
So
Again,
then the symptoms are like memories.
no, they're not like memories, but memory, in one sense, must utilize this center in which all of the multiplicity has been focused, and then can come back as a center. It's a kind of sleeping state, if you like, in which all that was present previously is held in solution, as it were, but it provides the basis for a new period of activity.
It's where memory is when we're not remembering.
Yes, that's right. So the new universe, the new system, yes, it's where memory is when you're not remembering. That's a good point. I find it a fascinating concept, and a most useful concept, and a most necessary concept in this total process. It makes possible the process, the unrolling of the process. It makes its ongoingness, its continuity, as I see it. So the new universe, as she says, Fohat seats the universe on these eternal foundations. Well, it's seated on, you see, the dissolvability of, it's seated on the solution, as it were, which now has in it all of the axial lines which can develop into the new universe. The new universe is seated on the eternal foundations. And
There's a point worth making here, though. She does say that the new universe comes into being not in, on, or through these centers.
I'm coming to that.
Sorry.
Yes, that's right. That she's very clear about, yes. So it's rather interesting, you see. So, of course, we have to remember that when she says the eternal foundations, eternal refers only to the lifespan, according to Mantantara. These centers then contain in essence or in germ the results of all past manvantras, provide the continuity from one system to the next in the cyclic progression, which is of course the thesis of the second fundamental proposition. Were it not for the Laya centers, in other words, there could be no transmission of experience from one stage of existence to the next. We begin to see then how very important this is. And in connection with Shloka 4, for example, of this stanza, when a planet dies, its informing principles are transferred to a Laya, or sleeping center, with potential but latent energy in it, which is thus awakened into life and begins to form itself into a new sidereal body. So she says, when Fohat is said to produce 7 Laya centers, it means that for formative or creative purposes, the great law stops, or rather modifies, its perpetual motion on 7 invisible points within the area of the manifested universe. Its motion is modified. Interesting. Well, a few further comments. We're almost to the end, and I haven't come to that statement which HCB indeed does make, that it is neither in, on, or through the Laya centers. I had that somewhere, Jeffrey, but I don't see it at the moment.
I mentioned it because it was one of my hang-ups when I was trying to understand this thing. I tried to think of these as points in space where the planets were going to be.
But it's not, you see. It's not points in space. That she's very clear about. And so she calls them 0 points, you see. And yet, from these non-existent points begins the differentiation of the elements which enter into the constitution of our solar system.
8145.
Yes. Oh. There we are. Yes. 145. Yeah. There we are.
What book's that in?
The worlds are built neither upon, nor over, nor in the Laya centers, the 0 point being a condition, not any mathematical thing. And that's in connection, of course, with Shloka 4. But as a consequence of them, the worlds are built in the likeness of older wheels. Now, older, incidentally, can be taken in 2 meanings, I suggest. Wouldn't you agree? Mm-hmm. Older is in 2 meanings. Either earlier in the whole process, or ancestral to the whole process in terms. Earlier in the process, or ancestral to the process. And I think both meanings are involved here. I really do. I think both meanings are involved.
Well, the one is the parent to the successor, always.
Yes, that's right.
Couldn't be otherwise.
And also earlier, so that because the whole thing is a mirror reflection. So
in the sense of each situation, the image comes forward.
But also in any sense of archetypal patterns repeated. Well, both earlier in the whole cosmogonic process and preceding in previous systems, you see, ancestral in previous systems. Both meanings, I think, are involved. Well, there's much else that we could say about these Laya centers. But perhaps that's enough before coffee. At least I think I've gone over about 3 minutes, so you better have your coffee. I referred yesterday to the work by G.D. Peruker, Fountain Source of Occultism, and he has some very interesting comments on this, suggesting, of course, as we've already said, that these are the rather than perhaps non-existent points, it might be even more accurate to say non-spatially existent points. That might be helpful. Non-spatially existent. I think that might clarify it. That, however, it is through these that the forces of one plane or sphere pass into the next succeeding one. And they are therefore points of communication, or points which make communication possible between all fields, among all fields, subplanes, planes, etc., within a system. To quote De Perucker, every celestial globe, and indeed every atom, is in its central core or essence such a Laya center, or point of individual intercommunion, which is the individual entity's pathway of communication with the next higher or lower inner plane or world. It makes communication possible. This I find very interesting in light of a previous statement, which I probably now cannot locate, well marked as my book is. But the creation of an impassable barrier, which is mentioned earlier in one of the shlokas, which seems then almost a contradiction in terms, to say that there is the possibility of communication and at the same time that an impassable barrier does exist at a certain critical point between the evanescent personality, egoic nature, and that which is enduring. So there seems to be at the same time what we can only call a kind of iron curtain put up. And yet perhaps even there is a point of dissolution of that. And there has to be, I would think. To quote further from De Perucker, through these Laya centers, whether it be of a solar or planetary globe, a human being, or an atom, the lowest or densest matter of a particular world can pass downwards into the next lower plane and can pass upwards. And he says, further, we see that these circulations can be envisaged in two ways. And this, I think, is possible because of their non-spatial characteristic. First, those taking place between what we may call plane and plane, or world and world, which we might call then an upward-downward movement, and vertical, or vertical movement, and second, lines of intercommunication that exist within one level, so that it makes possible a horizontal circulation within a field as well as between fields. If there were not such points within fields, that is to say horizontal, then communication within a field would not be possible. So that there is not only well, perhaps the most graphic way would be that there is communication between physical and psychic, but also among the psychic elements.
Now, this is more confusing still for me.
Well, I'm speaking not of communication in some, seance sense, but rather that there is a movement of the life energy through the fields, but throughout the fields, that it pervades the field.
That's okay, but the movement up and down, say,
Yes.
Involves a change of order of existence. When you say an atom can pass through these things, It can't.
No,
Its
not the atom.
consciousness can.
Yes, he's not saying that, he's saying that at the core, or the essence of the atom,
Yeah.
that emptiness, you
Yes.
see, is such a point of,
Yes.
of
Then go on, Dick.
then within the field itself, there is an intercommunication. There is, because a point, of course, has no dimension.
But that doesn't involve light as I see it.
This is what De Perucker is suggesting, that the lines of intercommunication exist within the field as well
but
as
it
well as
doesn't involve light. But the up and down movement does.
Yes, that it does.
Because you've had a change of order in being and in the sense used in each of the, as you pass through a light center, so
Yes.
it's a different order
Yes.
of senses hasn't come into existence.
That's right.
So that between, say, the psychic world and our world, there is that liar
Yes, there's
condition,
that liar condition.
which shuts the psychic world off from us in the normal way.
That's right.
From a practical point of view, it's much harder to experience the horizontal.
The horizontal, yes.
You've got to the polar bear sneezers at the North Pole at that stage.
That's right, yes.
I'm not with this at all.
Yes, well,
Expand.
No, we can't. Separately, yes, outside, but not.
not with him.
No.
Well, I'm bringing this forward because De Perucker makes this point, and I think it may be of some interest, I'm not sure.
Yes.
I can't really
So I'm
expound it
glad
any
it is,
further.
but I can't get it.
Yes, all right. Does anyone want to comment on this? Adam, how would you feel about it? Would you think De Perucker has a valid point in that?
I pass.
Well, I throw it out because I think
Yes.
De Perucker was a very good student, and therefore his works are worth considering. But I can't explain it any further.
May I ask one thing?
Yes, good.
I thought earlier it was associated with the chakra system, the Laya points. And in that case, it is some location in space.
No, it is non-spatial per se. Now, by analogy, I think one can associate it with the vortices that are known as the chakras. These are wheels. Chakra simply means wheel. So in one sense, our globe is a chakra, and indeed may constitute within the total planetary system a particular, have its correspondence with a particular chakra. In the physiological system or the biological system, certainly I wouldn't rule this out because analogy may carry on, correspondences may carry on, very true. But so from that point of view, but again, I wouldn't push the analogy too far because what we're talking about at this stage is the manner by which thought, the action of the primary energy, the primary dynamism. One of our meetings in the American section of our National Education Committee, one of our leading members, in fact, who is co-editor of the Theosophical Science journal in the United States, Dr. Ralph Hannon. Ralph is a professor of chemistry and also of physics at a university not far from Wheaton. And he, along with a couple of others, scientist members of our society there and of our National Education Committee, were very much opposed to our use of the word energy and force, which have specific meanings in physics, even though HPV uses these. And so I've sort of been, I suppose, brainwashed by their views and said, well, can I call it the dynamism, that it has a motion which participates in, it's a dynamic nature. He said, well, that's all right, you can do that. We spent, in fact, 2 days at one of our National Education Committee meetings trying to define Fohat without using either force or energy, if you can imagine, in order to satisfy the physicists, you see. Now, I don't know that we have to satisfy the physicists, but the point is, their point was that if we are going to speak meaningfully of this in terms that will reach, and of course, in the American section, a great deal has been done in an effort to put it in contemporary terminology and to be able to stand up, as it were, to not only the unique usage of terms in theosophical language, but also to be sure that we have not in some way violated terms that are very much in use in other disciplines of thought. So it's, one can say, well, this is a foolish enterprise, but on the other hand, I think it's something that we have to be often alert to.
I think I've had this argument with lots of people purists in the use of the terms force and energy, power and so on. I have found, I know something of their scientific or physical or engineering even definitions and use of those terms. It seems to me they're not violated in our literature. But it helps if we know their use of these terms.
It certainly helps if we know their use of them.
Yes, it might be worth some time going through and deriving these terms from the absolutes of weight and space and time,
right.
and that causing velocity, points of application and so on. And they are all precise.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I don't see why Dr. Cannon's cross with us.
He really isn't. He's merely pointing out that sometimes we use the terms very loosely.
Well, that may be.
And I think this is true. Ralph is not. Ralph Hannon is, and of course he himself is quite a student of the Secret Doctrine.
Mm-hmm. Does he think the terms are only used in here?
No, but he says that there are times when HPB, as we know, uses a term rather loosely.
A couple of points. The first one arising out of what Jeffrey was just saying. I was reminded as he was speaking of one of the Mahatma letters, number 11, I think it is, where they go through identifying what they call some absolutely misleading terms.
Yes.
And included amongst them are force, energy, matter, and so forth. And they say, we cannot express our ideas correctly in these because your perception of what these terms mean is radically different from what we mean by it.
That's right.
So, perhaps there is a problem with nomenclature here.
I think there really is, and I think we have to be alert to that, you see.
But can I come up on Adam's comment there? I think the master in that letter was trying to get us to understand that what latent in their terms meant and potential as applied to energy.
Yes.
And I can't follow it.
It's not easy, I agree. And of course, we have to remember that he was writing to Sinnott, who was typically well-educated, but typically a late 19th century thinker, and who had therefore only, if we can put it this way, only that frame of reference of the late 19th century into which to place these terms. I think this is something we have to keep in mind.
Yeah, but the master, in using the absolutes like force and energy and so on, seems to be using them in our way.
Yes.
It's only when we come to this potential and latent that there's a huge difficulty.
Right.
And also in the matter of momentum. It's worth looking at that.
Oh yes, it's very worth looking at that letter and trying to make something sorted out. I quite agree.
I simply think with regard to these words, a similar thing happens with the use of words like soul and spirit.
Yeah.
Two rules for us. One rule is when you use a term, you must know what you mean by it.
That's right.
And when you are reading a book, you must try to find out what the author means by that term.
That's right. This is one reason why I'm taking a lot of time on this particular concept. And perhaps I don't mean to muddy the waters by adding what some of these other thinkers have said about it, but only to try to indicate the multiplicity of meanings inherent within it, because we frequently do use a term, even soul or spirit, as Yankee says, and think we know what it means simply because we're able to label it. And I think this is one of the great fallacies that occurs always, that we use a word, and the moment we can tag it, I have frequently used as an example, a very homely one, perhaps, but many years ago I was given a gift of a lovely little glass, animal-like. It appeared to be an animal, you see. It was beautiful glass, and I was very fond of it. Now, it did not resemble any known animal. It had such a, but it had animal characteristics, if I put it that way, you see. But it was neither a rabbit, nor a squirrel, nor a horse, or a cow, or any known animal in its totality. So people, of course, would come into my room and they would admire this, and they would say, "What is it?" Now, I said, "It is a theozoa." Oh, how interesting. I've never seen a theozoa before. And I said, "Well, now you have seen a theozoa." And I think it's a, you see, zoa, you know, has the animal characteristics. Theo, you see, it was a creative animal.
Archetype.
It was an archetype. But you see, there is a certain satisfaction on the part of the hearer in my being able to say it is a theozoa. And that sort of, well, nice, it's all right, now we all know what a theozoa is. And this is what happens to us, really. When we're able to label something, we think, you see, the map is the territory, and the map is not the territory. Yes?
Can I go back to the horizontal
Yes.
lines? Just a thought here, but in Krishnamurti's medical, the state when he goes for walks, the state is described. Will that not be the horizontal lines?
Yes.
Yeah,
Going through the horizontal.
going through the horizontal rather than the vertical.
Yes.
I think perhaps so, yes.
But we're on such a journey or experience, comes the points that we call life. You see, it's a continuum there. You're in the same state all the time. You may be enjoying the scenery, or you may be counting your footsteps on the beach or something like that, but you're all within the physical world in a way.
It may be by analogy. Again, this is a very crude analogy which has popped into my head. Not well refined, therefore. It's you know, the raw material of therefore it's a crude analogy. But when we see a film, it appears to be a continuum, but it is composed of stills. And perhaps our progress through the world is quantized and appears as a continuum, but that the movement from still to still appears the flow, because we give it that flow because of the underlying continuum. But perhaps our experience is in terms of quanta.
The television fan is the same.
Yes.
And the phone is the same. You can call to many others by one line only, because the line is vibrating in all the points in that section. Yes, and they are interpreting without to touch one to the other. This is the concept of the initiate, maybe working in several points without to touch anyone at the same time, by several days.
Yes.
Right.
There may be some analogy here. Yeah.
We have to understand the scientists.
Yes, Miriam?
Very rough one, very, very rough, much less
I
subtle.
think it's very
But if you begin at the stage of father, mother, spin a web, and bring that down and down and down and down to our kind of understanding. If you watch a spider spin a web, there's a center point and there are radials. And then around that, the radials have to be a little bit stronger.
Yes.
Because around that it's got to go round and round and round and round and round. And therefore, by the basis of this structure, it's almost easier for us, given a point, any old point in the web, being at that position, it's easier for us to go on the stronger ones that go up and down.
Up and down. Rather
But
than
if
on
you
the-
want to get to a sideways one, that's very difficult for us. We've got to go right back to the centre
Yes.
and out again.
Not again.
And that means we've got to get a lot of levels from wherever we are to the centre to get the facility for the movement. Something like that.
There may, you see, I think by trying to think this through, we begin to perhaps, you see, the Buddhist speaks often of what are they called? I've forgotten. Point instance.
Yes.
And in fact, in the Islamic system, time is composed of point instance. This is very much an Islamic concept too. So that it's not a continuum, but point instance. Anyway,
There could be a now under that.
Hmm?
Under that system, there could be a now.
Yes, that's all there is, but because it is a succession of point instants. Anyway, we can think about it. Well,
Joy,
Yeah.
maybe because that we have each, the world in general and individual in particular, the point of no passing, the circle of no passing.
yes.
Because there are different points we have to find.
Well, there is, of course, very, very much more, and I've only touched the surface of this. It is something that I think we need to really consider. I think it is one of the fundamental concepts with which we're presented.
You can't do too much to understand it.
I think it's extremely important, and what we must recognize, of course, is that movement is innate, inherent in the Laya center, but it is potential movement, and it's awakened into activity by Foha. This is the dynamism that sparks it, as it were, and then rotation is immediately inaugurated, as it were, the circumgyratory movement. Yes.
Isn't it Krishnamurti who uses the word fragmentation? Would
Yes.
that be a good word for it?
For what?
Well, for viewing different things, like you were mentioning the movie film.
Yes, I think he uses, I would be careful, because I think Krishnaji uses that term in relation to another aspect of it, rather than what we're trying to suggest.
What was the word?
Fragmentation. And what I'm talking about is not the fragmented experience, but rather the continuum experience, which may be quantized. I would be careful of that term, fragmentation, in this connection. Frankly, I would, because I think then we get into another area, not of what is meant by the Laya center acting in a horizontal. It's a later stage. But if that satisfies you, go ahead.
Well, I'm thinking of the spaces between the fragmentation.
Well, of course, there's no space, you see, but on the other hand, you see. In any event, do think it through. All we can do is think it through. I think one of the interesting points, you see, is that HPB again quotes Sivaro. I think this is page 139, if I remember correctly. Yes. She's again quoting from the Bhagavad Gita lectures. She frequently quotes from these lectures, indicative, I think, of her recognition of their great importance. And certainly, as I suggest at least, the first lecture is the key one, the one that sets it forth. And she quotes, "The whole cosmos must necessarily exist in the one source of energy from which this light, Diva-Prakriti or Fohat, emanates." 139 towards the top of the page. She says, as well said in the Bhagavad Gita lectures, you see. And actually this is from the first of those lectures. So what this whole paragraph merits study, but what we now must take into consideration is that with the reawakening, as it were, of these centers, the production, the leading outwards of these Laya centers as the basis of the universe is now surrounding this with the elementary germs. So this, I think, we need then to move. Adam has already referred to this very meaningful shloka 3, and I don't need to go into that, of the 7 elements, first 1 manifested, 6 concealed, and so on. That has all been beautifully set forth in that diagram that Adam had for us yesterday. But what I would like to do, however, is pick up, therefore, from what Adam was talking about in that 1 evident and 6 concealed, and 2 manifested, 5 concealed, 3 manifested, 4 concealed. It's a marvelous sequence, of course, that we're given there. Is to spend just a little time now on an examination of this term, element, because I think that it merits perhaps some further emphasis, and particularly an elaboration on its meaning in a threefold manner, which I have put on the board, and I think which Adam did not touch upon in its threefold meaning. Everything in a manifested system is composed then of these rudiments or elements produced emanationally from the one through the Laya centers, or by means of the Laya centers. Now, in their primary condition, perhaps, if I can call it that, they are known as the tattvas. And HPB indeed points out that the entire universe is composed of the tattvas. So there are 3 terms, however, that need to be considered, I feel, in this respect. And it may be helpful right at this point to make these distinctions. Primarily then, they are the measures of that, or they are the qualities of that. Tattva. T-A-T, that, the primordial one, if you like, and the tva, or quality of that. And it is these, of course, that we have already seen, the swift and radiant one, Fohat, bringing about, seating the universe on the eternal foundations of the Laya centers, surrounding this phenomenal universe, which is here as the Xinxian, surrounding it with the elementary germs, as she calls them at this stage. Now, the very word germ indicates a life present within it, doesn't it? The very use of that word is indicative that life is, that the growth possibility is present. And therefore, these can, in this aspect, they are then tattvas, which refers to the growth side, I would like to suggest, the spirit side, if you like, the force side, that which enables the element principle to change or alter its condition as the emanational process continues. By calling them elementary germs, the possibility then of growth, of an alteration of condition, you see, which is inherent in the word germ. Not just the elements. Now, you see in Shlokas 3, she says of the seven, you see, and then says elements. But these are germs also. And that is contained really in the very word tattva, that it has that aspect, the spirit side, if you like, the life side, which enables it to change or alter its condition. But the vehicular side of the element, if you want to call it that, the form side, the matter side, the distinction is not at all an easy one by any means, is referred to as the tanmatra side. And I refer you to page 572 then of volume 1. And this is in the section, if you have the Adyar edition, it's going to be in the second volume, and it's going to be the section 11 of the second section of volume 2, in a section called On the Elements and Atoms. It's a section really which ought to be studied in this, all of this connection, I would suggest. 296 of volume 2 of the Adyar edition. In the first edition, it's page 572, where she refers to these primordial intelligent elements which become the centers or the emanators of the monads destined to become human in this cycle, after which they evolve themselves and expand into their own selves. I think this lends further credence to the diagram which Adam used yesterday. If you want to retreat into the Dayan Chohans, which can be also the Dhyani Bodhisattvas, all of that, you see, present there, the collectivity of the creative, of the Chohanic hosts. Now, there is a footnote there, which I think is an extremely important one, which tells us, and this is in reference to a statement which she is quoting, which began on the previous page, you will say, a passage found in the Anugita, which read esoterically, shows plainly this. The tanmatras, she says, now literally, the word tanmatra is from tat, that, and matra, to measure. It's the same root verb, ma, as we have in maya, magic, and all of that, you see. It's the measurability. Now, the moment you introduce that kind of quality, now it's not that you're going to measure these at this point, 6 inches long and 5 feet high or something like that. But the moment you introduce this quality, you have introduced a vehicular side or form side. So the tanmatras are literally the type or rudiment of an element devoid of qualities, but esoterically, they are the primeval noumena of that which becomes, in the progress of evolution, a cosmic element in the sense given to that term in antiquity, not in physics. That is, not in chemistry, of course. But they are the logoi, the 7 emanations or rays of the logos. So there is this side also that must be acknowledged, the tanmatra side, you see.
I inverted my thought on this from yours. I made the tanmatras the noumenon and therefore the spiritual essence of these things, and the tattvas the form side, that they have qualities. I don't know whether you go on with that.
I'm,
That's what
I
I
mean,
think.
yes, it's worth thinking about. I've given it a lot of thought. The distinction that I have decided to follow is that which Barborka takes in the Divine Plan, pages
Well, I did that
170.
first and then checked.
Yes. So I had it your way first, and then the more I thought about the way Barborka presented it in the Divine Plan, the more I thought perhaps the very concept of measurability, which is inherent in the root tanmatra, would have to refer to the form or vehicular stuff.
Yeah, I just took up that word noumenon.
Yes, of course, she does say esoterically, you see.
Does matras and matrix have any? Does matras and matrix have any
Yes,
relationship?
yes, yes.
And that would relate then to form side.
To form
Which
side.
again, yes.
It's very confusing.
It is confusing, but I finally, after a long thought, decided to accept Barborka. I think I once discussed it with Jeffrey Barborka, and we were working together on some of this. And I finally felt inclined to agree with him. Now there is...
Incidentally, I can't find any of this on 571. Is this followed
572. 572.
572.
There's a footnote there.
Yeah, that's what it
You see.
is.
It's she's quoting from the Anagita, you see.
And is it not the fact that her Greek has gone wrong, and the Boris Zerkov edition of the SD, which polishes up some of the words, it has corrected it to noumena.
Yes, that's right. What is it in the original noumenon?
No, OI, which is quite
which is
incorrect.
quite incorrect. No,
Yeah.
Boris corrected that to noumenon, which is the correct Greek form.
Noumena, yes. I wonder whether it's somebody's handwriting where the OI had been written
It may well have
close
been.
together.
Yes, it may well have
And then they
been.
could look like
Yes.
an A.
That may well have been, but her Greek was off, and Boris did correct her
Yes,
Greek and
yes.
Hebrew and so on. All right. Now there is a third aspect, and I thought I had the reference of HPV on that, and I seem to have misplaced it, so I will just let it be. That you will have to find the reference. But the third aspect is known as the Mahabhutas. I think it is. I think it's, yes, I'm quite sure it's in the esoteric tables. Yes, in some of the tables there. I'm not sure whether it's in one that Jeffrey has given us. I'm not.
No, it isn't.
I don't think so. No.
It's in the pages near to that.
Near to that, though, yes. And these are spoken of, the Mahabhutas. But it completes the threefold meaning. And Maha, of course, means great. Bhuta, of course, comes from bhu, to be. But the interesting thing is that it is past tense. And therefore could be translated the great have-beens.
Has-beens.
Well, in their plural, have-beens. The great have-beens. Better to have been something than nothing at all. What is that? Better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. So this is also present, and it may be used to refer, therefore, to, in one sense, if you like, the content that will be revealed, which has to do with the skandhas, if you like, or more properly, the sishtas, the seeds, and therefore these elementary germs are not something that sprung out of nothing, because that is not consonant with the process by any means, But germs arise out of the fruits of previous systems. And so this aspect, I think, must really be present, the Mahabhuta aspect. Yes, she brings this in only in her esoteric writings, but it is something extremely important to recognize. So the elements that she is speaking of that now emerge, you see.
I wonder whether it's stretching a point too far to see the essential ideas of this in the Chandogya Upanishad, where the father is trying to teach Svetaketu about the essential self, and he tells him to bring the fruit of a tree.
Yes.
And the young man brings it and says, "Here it is, sir." Father says, "Break it." "It is broken, sir." "What do you see?" "Some seeds, extremely small, sir." "Break one of them." "It is broken, sir." "What do you see?" "Nothing, sir." And then the father explains, "The subtle essence you do not see, and in that is the whole of the tree. Believe, my son, that that which is the subtle essence, in that have all things their existence. That is the truth. That is the self, and that art thou."
Very true, you see. So it is in that seed, but the seed indicates there has been a fruit,
Yeah.
even though nothing is in it.
Nothing visible, nothing
visible,
perceptible.
nothing perceptible.
And there is the transverse movement.
In this also, Yanti has quoted the Chandogya Upanishad. There is a marvelous passage in the Mundaka Upanishad, which I think says something similar in regard to the arising of the elements in this whole, which I think is very pertinent here, since Yanti has quoted the Chandogya. The Mundaka puts this whole shloka in this form. "This is the truth. As from a blazing fire, thousands of sparks, similar to it in nature, issue forth, so manifold beings are produced from the imperishable, and they verily go back to it again. Self-resplendent, formless, unoriginated, and pure, that all-pervading being is both within and without. Anterior both to life and mind, he transcends even the unmanifested causal that of the universe. From him are born life, mind, senses, ether, air, fire, water, and earth that supports all."
What was that from?
The Mundaka.